Okay, the third video we're going to get into talking about is actually going into chapter 11 of your textbook, and that is on personality. And we're going to get into the third school of psychology now, and that is psychodynamic perspective. In your book, you need to be reading in chapter 11, pages 293 to 300. And the first thing we're going to kind of get into is we're going to be looking at this guy, Sigmund Freud, and what's called psychodynamic perspectives. Now, from the video that we've been watching in class, just a kind of a review over that, a couple things about Sigmund Freud. He was born in 1856. He came from a middle-class Jewish home in Vienna, Austria. He did have kind of a bizarre family life, as you got from the video. He had a much older father and a much younger mother. He also had two half-brothers that were quite a bit older than him, and that was actually closer to the age of his mother. That was not his biological mother, but was his father's third wife. The reason why that this is kind of important is because it gives you some perspective into understanding a little bit about who this guy was and the theories that Sigmund Freud's going to develop. Over the years, his theories have been refuted, they've been destroyed, they've been ripped apart, but then he always comes back. And more psychologists are starting to look back at his theories and are beginning to take a new perspective into what was some of the things that he believed in. We're going to get more into that too. Some other things, he decided to be a doctor. He does eventually meet his wife, Martha. They had what was called a very Victorian romance, which means that they didn't spend a lot of time together, physical time together. It was more of a long-distance relationship. They were engaged for 4 years, and the video kind of talks more about this. He did use cocaine. Now, remember, back at the time, that was not illegal to do. He was trying to find a use for it that could give him a financial success, and that he would be able to become very popular and well known, and that way he could get married. He tried to use it as an anesthetic. Didn't work out for him. One of his close friends, died from the use of cocaine, so he stopped the use of it. He never was addicted to it, but it just again gets you a little bit of an idea who this guy was. Eventually, he does get into the mental health area, and that's where he will become great success and well-known, and probably one of the most well-known psychologists around. The two areas that Sigmund Freud basically pushed in and drove towards was dealing with sex and aggression. Again, when we look at these two issues, they've been over the years kind of stigmatized, and he's been looked upon in many areas as being kind of this dirty old man dealing with the ideas of sex, but that's not what really Freud was about. Freud, one of his problems was he didn't really get into a lot of deep discussions. And again, it goes back to his young age, being very well taken care of by his mother. He was called that golden Siggy. He kind of had a narcissistic idealism about himself, so he didn't thought that he really had to explain himself very much when he was writing his theories. So it took a while for psychologists to really get a better understanding. But when Freud talks about sex, he's not talking about the physical part of sex necessarily. That is one part of it. But really what he was talking about is the whole realm. Everything from being able to have contact to being able to have the mental part of a sexual relationship, getting into the ideas of being able to just talk to and communicate with people of the opposite sex, the ideas of that, the ideas of love, not just with someone from the opposite sex, but also from your parents to other people. All kinds of areas when he came into this. He was looking at a lot of things about people who were repressed when it came to sexual feelings and sexual behaviors, anxieties about it, neuroses. All of those things impacted a person's ability to develop their personality and also their behaviors. Same thing with aggression. He wasn't just looking at the physical act of someone fighting somebody else. He was looking at the aggression that we do to each other and to ourselves. And that's again, not just physical, but also mental and emotional. And he was looking at the ideas about obsessions and how we aggressively tend to get attached to things and doing things, fears, anxieties, and phobias. So when I talk about this idea of these two main drives of sex and aggression, you need to be able to understand that it is a wide open area that Freud was focusing on, of those two things that basically he says is what drives humans to do everything of the behaviors that we do. The theory that Freud developed then was called the psychoanalytical theory. Basically, it was an attempt to explain personality, motivation, and the mental disorders by focusing on the unconscious. And that's an important part to make sure you get down there, is that it was focusing of the unconscious mind, not necessarily the conscious mind. And that again gets into a lot of misconceptions about Freud. He wasn't saying that we are driven by sex because we sit and think about it all day in our conscious state. We don't. Basically, what he's saying is that this is that dark, deep part of our minds that we don't even realize is having all these free-flowing thoughts going through it, going back to the idea of functionalism. Freud believed that in our unconscious part of our mind, that is where these deep, hidden parts of our thoughts are flowing through, and we don't even realize it, but it is affecting our behaviors. And that's what he wanted to prove. And that's what he was trying to get his theory to be able to substantiate. The problem was he didn't have a lot of the technology. He didn't have a lot of that empirical, data-driven ability to show what he was trying to say. He was just basically throwing out these theories, and the problem was he didn't have a lot of things to back it up. So as a result of that, he was torn apart in a lot of the psychological areas of other psychologists because he did not have this documentation. Today, psychologists are going back now and trying to reprove some of his theories, and they are finding that there's a lot of substantiation to those, and we'll kind of get a little bit more into that. Some of the other parts of the theory called psychoanalytical theory is what's called transfer of feeling, which is taking one unconscious feelings of sex and aggression and turning it towards others. We do this sometimes when we get into relationships. Sometimes we think that someone cares for us more than they do by just simply smiling at us or maybe showing us some kind of affection. We take that to the extreme, thinking that they are in love with us or that they have these deep feelings when maybe they don't. And that's the same thing when it comes to aggression. Sometimes you have these feelings towards somebody else that of hostility, anger, because maybe they've been successful in something that you have not, so you kind of get jealous or you get these other feelings that you kind of turn towards them. Another one of his theories is the Oedipus complex, which has taken a lot of hits over the years as being something that was ridiculous and something that, again, got Freud into a lot of trouble. And it's the idea of the opposite attraction of the parent of the child. In other words, the little boy having these feelings towards their mother, and then the daughters having these sexual feelings towards their father. And again, Freud didn't get into a lot of discussion here. He didn't get into a lot of explanation and detail about his theories. But over the years, they've been able to, through testing and through data of observations and other types of experiment, that they've been able to find that Freud was not too far off in some ways. If you watch a lot of little kids, 2, 3 years old, they will make those attachments, those relationships, those connections to the opposite sex parent. And, you know, that's where you get the ideas of daddy's little girl or mommy's little boy comes into play, and the connections that come from that. Freud did not mean that little boys wanted to have sex with their mommies and vice versa with their daughters with their fathers. It was this connection mentally, the attachment that they would have with the emotion, not the sexual feeling part of that. And that got a lot of people confused about that. But the Oedipus complex does have a lot to talk about when it comes to the idea of how we build relationships with the opposite sex. And if you don't have that connection, that ability to build that relationship at a very young age, it can lead to other problems down the road. And we're seeing this a lot with divorces, and where especially you have the children living with mom and the little girls don't have that opportunity to make that attachment to their father. That can cause a lot of problems down the road later on for them to be able to develop into long-lasting relationships with a male counterpart. Same thing with boys, because a lot of times the moms have to become both parents, the mother and father, and that can become very confusing for the boys as they are trying to develop that young, early relationship with them. Another one is Freudian slips, which is the meaningless slips of the tongue, trying to reveal the person's true feelings. Again, your book talks about this, and so does the video we'll kind of get into. But again, a lot of psychologists refute this and disagree with saying that basically it's nothing more than just a person's inability to get their thoughts through and into their speech. But Freud says no, actually it's an unconscious part of our minds that is slipping out into our conscious state. And so sometimes we may say something to someone that comes out wrong, and Freud says you actually meant what you said. And so again, it's one of those concepts that we get into. The death drive and the penis envy are the last two major parts of what's called the psychoanalytical theory. The death drive gets into this concept of aggression. It's Freud's belief that we have this deep, again, hidden, deep, dark idea or belief that we want to destroy ourselves. And there's a lot, again, data here that we watch and see dealing with wars that we get into as a world history over the years, but also the personal destruction when it comes to smoking, drinking, those kinds of things that we know is bad for us, overeating, obesity, and yet we do it anyway. The last one is this penis envy, and again, this got Freud into a lot of trouble because of the way that he described this back in the 1900s there. It was not exactly a time of sexual revolution going on, and so people got very upset when they heard him talk about this. But what it is nothing more than Freud's belief that women wanted to attain the same power and superiority that men have in the world. And so he basically looked at it and said, what do women not have that men do? And it's this idea of the penis, which gives the male this superiority. It wasn't that they were wanting the physical part of the penis. It was the idea that they wanted the power that the men attain by being able to have dominance over the women in the world. And again, a lot of psychologists are looking at this today, and we have more women going to college. We have more women graduating in upper level education than men do. Women are earning more than men in many cases. You see women with wearing pants, whereas back in the early 1900s, that was something that was taboo. Women cutting their hair, more women taking over jobs that predominantly were male dominated. So yes, we are seeing a change in the sexual revolution in our nation and in the world too. And Freud would say today that his theory is very much accurate, that women are attaining the superiority and that they are beginning to take over in many different realms. And so he would be saying that his theory was very much accurate. Finally, the last thing we're going to look at here is basically what are called the three assertions of Freud that kind of got him into a lot of trouble and that got people very upset. One is the suggestion that individuals are not masters of our own minds. He believed that because the unconscious mind, which we don't get to control those thoughts are just flooding through our minds at all times, high speeds. We don't realize they're going through, but he says they are affecting us. Basically, they influence the way that we behave. And the realities dealing with this multiple shapings can cause us to do a lot of behaviors that we don't realize that we're doing. We don't know why we're doing them. We don't know why we say some of the things we do or act the way we act. And he believed that's because we're not in control of our own self. The second thing is he believed adult personalities are shaped by their childhood experiences. In other words, the way you are right now is based upon how you were raised as a very small child. And this guy, again, gets a lot of people upset because of the fact that what he claims is we are not masters of our own destiny. Basically, Freud says that what happens to you now in the future as you get older is basically nothing more than what is because of what happened to you in the past. So you really don't have an opportunity to change your life. Your personality is set. And he says that you are basically not going to be able to change it, and you're pretty much stuck with who you are. Excuse me. Again, a lot of psychologists disagree with this wholeheartedly, that Freud was wrong on this, and that we do change our personalities, we do manipulate them, we are in control of our own lives, and so they get very upset with this. The last part of Freud's theory that has gotten a lot of argument is dealing with this part of what's known as the unconscious mind, and that this deep, dark, anxiety-driven part of our brain has more dominance over us than the rest of the brain does. And again, a lot of psychologists don't agree with this, and they kind of argue against it. And then dealing with that, dealing with the information that gathering the process is limited and non-aware. And more that we are finding when we're looking at the brain is that there is a large part of our brain that, yes, we do have these thoughts running through, but it's not so much anymore believed that it's an uncontrollable part of our brain. We do now believe that it's more of just these free-flowing thoughts that don't necessarily affect a lot of our behaviors. So there is some disagreement with Freud. Of course, he didn't have the technology to deal with this as what we do today to look at our brain. But as we get more into Freud here and we start watching more of the video, you'll learn more about how this guy was able to why he's looked upon as being really a mainstay figure in the psychological field, and why, even though his theories are no longer as much held, the fact is that he has put a lot into the psychological area, and he has been able to really mold what has become the context of psychology today.